right. We are here with Gellena, who is our social media expert. Hello again, Janelle.
Hi.
And we're talking today about how to win on social media in Q4. You know, it's a busy holiday season. It's in a unique election year. And I'd love for Gellena, you just to start and tell us what are some of your recommendations for brands and advertisers this year?
Yeah, that's fair. And I think one thing to just think about, especially with this holiday season, is to your point, the trends of e-commerce, of the holiday being pushed, and social commerce specifically forecasted at 2 trillion by next year. It's definitely a great time to be on a social platform, especially post-pandemic. The user activity for short form video, for engaging in content has gone up exponentially. And social as a channel has kind of gone through a lot of different phases. Right now, TikTok has just created their search tool, which is disruptive to Google. That's going to be a huge impact in the holiday season. Meta's made a couple of changes too, impacting their store locator feature, where now they're having more user behaviors in the algorithm to track that AI with ASC, a lot less levers that people are manually putting in. So, because you have less kind of audience data and capabilities in platform, your creative and your immersive experience is now more important than ever. So you want to make sure that your creative and your branding is resonating throughout, and really figure out where social is in your media mix, because most brands don't just run on social, they run across the gamut of every channel. And you want to make sure that the creative looks holistic throughout. You're saying the same thing across, and that your brand is coming across as recognizable. There's so much clutter in the market right now, and I see 10,000 ads a day, especially if you're on different channels, that you want to make sure that the places that you're seeing it make sense for you, and that you're giving an experience, right? Like, you're not just saying, please buy this product now. You're leaving people with some recall and, some kind of memory. So for some of our luxury brands, it could be the idea that crystal spans generations, and you're at the family dinner table with, your mom, your dad, your grandma, and you're using the same kind of beautiful tablescapes that you have at every holiday season, and they're always there for you in those moments. And then when you have that ad on Pinterest, you're speaking to that life moment. That you're having family in different photos using different products, that you're speaking to users in their holiday like cheer moment, and that you're there for them and they feel like you're kind of giving them an experience versus an ad, especially with that form of TikTok, with influencers, with us all focusing more on recognitions of ads versus clutter. I think that's going to be pretty key. We are going to see CPMs go up. Election season is important. It's much more competitive. So if your brand does not need to be there for the holiday season, that's also something to consider. So like, we have a lot of brands that are in the education space, and this might not be the best time for them to be in market, right? Because there's so much competition, and to them, there's no difference between converting now versus in January, where it's going to be much more efficient. So it's also being there when it makes sense for you. Like for e-commerce, this is kind of a no-brainer. This is the Super Bowl. This is their time to shine. Travel, education, like there's kind of a little bit of vagueness there. Depends on what you're trying to sell. We see really good performance in Q5 too. So it's figuring out where in the media mix you want to be, and how you want to win with your brand. And again, it's also taking a look at how do you perform historically. Like someone like Janelle looks at media mixes and where social has succeeded. Like we have places where social is very mid-funnel, and it helps with fostering leads and nurturing those relationships. And it's also a place to have those conversations, right? Like we integrate with Sprout Social, and it's unsolicited information that people are putting out about your brand. They might be talking about your product. They might be asking for things that you haven't given, or just correlating themes, like using specific syntax that keeps coming up, and maybe you need to change your content strategy or how you're speaking to the users. So there's a lot of test and tried A/B testing kind of opportunities, which I think a lot of our brands have already done. And now we're coming into the holiday season like ready to convert. But there was all the work that you had to do to get there, and fostering awareness and having, the discovery touch points that we all kind of did in the last quarter to get to here.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I love your imagery about the family sitting around the holiday table. That's absolutely true. Although my family's more the plastic cup type than the luxury.
That's fair.
But I'm curious about kind of that emotional connection, and some brands, like I know T-Mobile jumped on top of the fully aware baby. trend on TikTok and some of that kind of ephemeral influencer content. What do you see as the future for influencers in Q4? Is there a right or wrong way to engage with them?
It's interesting. I think influencers, if you're working with them, they have to feel authentic to your brand. And it has to make sense for your brand. Otherwise, you can have a really bad Budweiser moment. So it's also finding people that are effective for what you're trying to say, and people that are already kind of speaking to what your brand is always practicing, whether it's sustainability, whether it's more that family focus, or someone who's always using your products and now could be your brand ambassador. You don't want someone that only talks about your competitors. You want someone that people feel like is their friend. And people trust influencers more than they trust traditional advertising. So it's if you give up that authenticity and that engagement, then you might as well just run an ad. It's cheaper and it's much easier to implement. Whereas with an influencer, it's a long journey. It's kind of like your friend telling you about a product, and then you go into the store and you're like, okay, like I heard about it from this person that I know I've tried 5 other things for and I trust them. So that trust is built over time, and it's not something you can do overnight. But influencers, when you're working with them, they already have this market. They've already tapped into this community that trusts them. And there's ways around it too. Like if you don't have the dollars for influencer marketing, we've seen Reddit work really well because people go there for product recommendations and they have that sense of community within the people on the platform. And it's a little cheaper to go into those subreddits than it is to work with a, macro, micro influencer. So there are avenues to do it. But the referrals specifically, I mean, think about in your own day to day. Like, are you more likely to trust your friend or an ad in the space?
Well, we're in advertising, so it depends, but point well taken, though.
So if you're working with brands who are hesitant to kind of really invest in social and to make their brand present in these spaces, how would you go about kind of working with them and, convincing them, maybe not convincing is the right word, but how would you go about working with them to make sure that, if they've had bad experiences in the past, if they haven't seen returns, like how would you work with them and get them situated into the right social platforms?
That's a good question. And I think for me, as someone who likes numbers, like the data, right? The historical information of what's running, what hasn't run. Like, is there things that we need to lean on that have performed or haven't performed? Is there specific content or promotions that we have brands that do really well during the holidays, but then they have a seasonal ad. And even though it's similar, it doesn't perform well because the demand and market isn't there. So it's knowing your brand, being consistent with your brand voice, and then, leveraging the tools that you have, whether that's your agency or in-house. I think, Janelle, like you and I have worked a lot with some of these brands that do have a couple of different channels across the board. And social isn't generating the returns, but search is. And then when we turn off social, we don't see that impact on search. And then, you can implement UTM codes. You can work with a media mix model. You can figure out where each channel is succeeding for you. Do all the split tests and the A/B tests before the holiday season, ideally, and make sure that you're ready to go for the holidays. But working with an agency or someone who knows the media mix, how to do that in a way that's effective and scalable is, I think, the first way to do it. Because people at the end of the day, they want to see returns. They want to see the numbers. But you can't just have people on search as a last touch conversion point, because then how are people discovering your brands? And the holiday season specifically is a time where people are over indexing in discovering these brands through these different aspirational channels, through social, through TikTok, through Meta, through Reels, through kind of all these different avenues. And if you've already tested them through and you know which ones are performing where, maybe that makes sense. So for us, for some brands, Meta's a really great awareness play, but we don't see leads and we don't really see conversions. But LinkedIn is a really good place to have that last touch point. And then from LinkedIn, we also see that effect on Google. And we can kind of create those percentages based on the revenue goal and where they need that impact. But if you're not willing to do the testing period, if you're not willing to do the homework, and if you're not willing to trust the data, I think that's also a hard part. A lot of the data in the platforms is modeled. So you need one unified measurement system across the board. So like if I'm speaking in terms of Meta and someone else is speaking in terms of Google, like even if they have similar attribution windows, we're talking in different conversations and it's not really a fair comparison point. So you need something in-house with an agency that kind of tells you like, this is my source of truth and this is how I'm going to judge success. And if you're coming into me without anything to correlate data, like how are we going to judge if we're successful? We can't, right? I can tell you your CPM is more efficient than last year, but that could be demand based. I can tell you you're getting more purchases, but is it because of social, or is it because you have new branding in market? You know, have you done a brand lift study? Have you changed anything in Google? And I think when you're working with an agency that touches each facet, especially the analytics too, you have someone that's touching everything and can say, oh yeah, I did actually put a PMAX campaign in then, or ASC, or we did do a new strategy across the board. And we talked about your new product in a way that was messaging that worked really well 6 months ago, and we're bringing it back, but we're adding like a little holiday twinkle to it, right? Whatever it is, like having the same person touch each of these touch points and then effectively being able to actually say, did it perform? And it sounds so basic, but we have so many brands that have 15 different ways to look at data, like Google Analytics and Adobe and the platforms. And then sometimes they're like, well, I want to see Meta, but Meta is model. But I want to see TikTok and I want to see this. And some of them have 13 different attribution windows that it's really hard if you don't have one person that knows what they're doing to kind of effectively gauge that media and say like, yeah, you did do good this year. Amazing. Otherwise, it could just be media as is, you know?
One of the phrases that I'm sure you've heard me use before and laughed at me is, judging a fish by how well it rides a bicycle. And we're doing that a lot with media. We're like trying to prove immediate last touch revenue from our branding and our awareness ads, even our mid-funnel ads. And I feel like that happens a lot more with social. And when we were speaking earlier, Gellena, about all of the different types of audiences and awareness that we're cultivating, I'm not going to expect to see necessarily revenue generated from that in the last 7 days. And I think it's really hard for brands to kind of trust that investing in this is going to drive that revenue long term. We're just not going to see it attributed in the platforms. It's not going to be the 7-day look back window.
Right. Yeah.
And the platforms in general, like a lot of their capabilities, while they're growing in terms of content and creative, they're scaling back in who you can target. You have to work with your third-party segments yourself. Like you have to find the live ramps of the world and integrate Epsilon data, like the stuff that was already in platform before all these lawsuits, before, the brands had to kind of take on that liability themselves. Like there was a lot more audience levers. And now with AI, with ASC, with this deprecation, like you kind of own a lot more of that audience relationship too. And it's so important to look at your first party data to be able to do lookalike modeling, because the platforms just don't have the same levers they used to. And I think you don't want to go all the way back to just persona marketing, right? But there is kind of something to be said about finding your niches and being able to target them effectively, and then finding audiences based on that, whether, it's a tool where you can find users that have worked with airlines, right? And target by HHI or class, like first class versus, kind of business class, depending on the luxury of a hotel. And I think there's so many tools out there that people don't even know about, that it's a little overwhelming. Like, we worked with a brand that did roofs, and for us, weather ads were really important because whenever there was a big storm or like crazy rainstorms going on, like people would use them more than any other time. And just figuring out like that demand and like, how do you create that effectiveness? How do you create that need? Is it when you have to go to the doctor, right? And it's gross out. Like, is that the time where you want to push a tool where like a doctor could come to you in your home? Like that would be great, right? Like, I don't want to go out when it's sleet. Or like, Uber does that really well. Like they do ads, Uber Eats, whenever there's like rainstorms, or I feel like every time there's bad weather, I got a promo code saying like, please get 20% off to buy pizza right now. And I was like, correct. Like I'm not getting out of my apartment. That's when I'm using this. So it's also like feeling like you're creating that demand in a time when a user thinks like, thank you for being there for me when I need you, and nurturing that relationship versus just like a very generic, acronym is an independent agency, like everyone can Google search something. It's what is your ad saying that like I can't just figure out from like a basic search.
I like the way you said that, to be there when you're needed.
Yeah, that's really unique. Definitely a shift from what social media used to look like. I've noticed that you're really holistic media planners now in social media. You have to know the first party and third party data. You have to understand brand moments and cultures. You have to understand full funnel measurement to be able to be effective in those channels. So really great insights there. Anything else, Gellena or Janelle, to add about Q4 social media and how to win this holiday season?
I always say people don't bring this up enough. Like, obviously performance matters, but I also say brand safety. You want to make sure that you're checking your placements, especially with an audience network or tools where they go beyond the platforms. LinkedIn has the same thing. It's not really the time to be there, especially with an election period, right? Like, you get some unsafe placements, and that, even if you get good performance, like, that's detrimental to a brand to be there in the wrong time. I saw an ad, for a Florida-based brand during the hurricane come into my feed, and I was like, wow, that's awful. That is not the time to be present. And even though performance might be good, right? Like, that's not a time to scale your media. That's a time to turn it off, or like speak to cause marketing, or stuff that you're doing to help. And that's just one example. Like, when with the election period, we've seen specifically people feel a certain way about certain candidates. Like, you don't want to be in the feed for that. And I know that the platforms are working really hard to combat misinformation and things in platform, but monitoring your comments, seeing what's happening, especially if you're a brand that is correlated to these periods, or like an education, whatever it is, you want to make sure that you're very specific about where you are and why you're there. And this isn't even just social. This is across the board. I've seen some very strange placements come up. So brand safety, putting those filters in place, there's ad kind of things that you can do. Make sure that you're not in gambling, make sure you're not in politics, make sure you're not in religious placement, and you can filter all those out in Meta and most of these tools. And it's such a simple button, but a lot of times people don't do it, right? Or in AFC, you can maybe exclude Florida for a period of time with the hurricane. So, it's figuring out how to be safe and scalable. And I think sometimes, like, it's better to be safe than sorry, and having a crisis control in-house. And again, this isn't just a social specific thing. Like, you can do it programmatic, you can do it cross-channel, but being very specific about why you're in placements and turning off anything that could kind of kick you in the butt later.
Great advice. All right. I think we've got a lot of insights from you today, and we'll probably check back with you soon for more information as we approach Q1 next year. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Gellena.
Talk later.
Thank you.